Today I want to talk about one of the thought experiments I did recently, and I really broke it down in an honest and real way, that I did not like my conclusions, because I have never been enthusiastic about, to put it lightly, like that is a gross understatement, of I've never been enthusiastic of the thought that humans live in a simulation. And why is that? I think for pretty obvious reasons. How computers work, how code works. It executes exactly what you tell it to do. That's very predetermined. That's deterministic in the same way worshiping a god is in monotheism. So it's something I was never enthusiastic about. And I still am not. And I'm a bit concerned of why I'm starting to see it as at the other end, because part of my very difficult journey in life is challenging every assumption I had previously, and I want to find as much evidence as possible. And if something logically lines up, I'm going to consider it. So one thing I want to do also is share some. I was trying to write a book. I'm still trying to write a book on the nature of consciousness and spiritualism. And I might read some of it because I think it is related to this. But one thing is one of my conclusions also from taking this thought experiment to its non-deterministic origin, is that it's also kind of scary to think that you are conscious in a simulation of some sort, in a program. I think when people assume that wouldn't be possible, yes, in binary coding, that does not seem very possible, to me anyway. I don't know if I'm reaching, but I just obviously reality would be an advanced program. It would not be a binary code. It would not be old computing. It would be effective, quote unquote, quantum computing. It would be that we've actually achieved quantum computing in some ways. And in quantum computing, you want the computer as cold as possible, and you want qubits. And the nice thing about qubits is they have a sort of non-committal quality. They can have Schrodinger on and off, elements at the same time. And that's really a huge appeal of qubits, and why they are working so hard right now in quantum computing to get qubits stable, because it's actually really hard to stabilize qubits. And they're also doing that with topology and topological what is it called, chips right now. And I find that really interesting, and I will also talk about topology again in this thought experiment, because I feel like once you view it this way, there's there's too many synchronicities or overlap where topology also comes into it. And I will talk about, first of all, just exploring this thought that the universe we live in is quantum coded, what I think its mechanics are, and what I don't know, and what I think its flaws are in the program. Yes, I think there are flaws in the program. So I will read to you some of my thought experiment. Let's see. I'm trying to find where I should start. I think I'll open with, because I lead into that from Christianity and Christian thought experiments in this text, and I think that's important. And first of all, I like open it up with posturing eternity and the eternal nature of things. So I will just like read some of this and get into the simulation part, and then say why it's actually quite convincing. Okay. And also like the advanced mechanisms I think are at play here. Which is why I'm making all these videos on consciousness, because I think that's one of the mechanisms. But anyway, the eternal nature spirituality proposes is in itself the greatest argument against the need for suffering as a spiritual lesson. Sorry, a lot of how I started this was like, why do we suffer? Which is still one of my biggest gripes in life. Why is there such extreme suffering? But yeah, if there is a need to express ourselves beyond physical limitations and linear time expressed in art, philosophy, and scientific breakthroughs, then by our nature we are searching for fulfillment beyond the world as we know it today. While much of the world has deprioritized this need as frivolous or unnecessary in a modern context, the failures of our society and the loneliness and apathy of many of our symptoms are this very the failures of our society and the loneliness and apathy of many are symptoms of this very need expressed. I believe we do not feel dissatisfied to merely cover up this feeling or erase our identities of self. In fact, it is not possible to build a spiritually sustaining system on acts of erasure or amnesia. I'm going to make another video about that. Questions do not arise to be suppressed and buried once they arrive. Any belief system that does not embrace the questioning of foundational knowledge does not encourage growth or evolution. Many spiritual traditions assert that we are here to grow as spiritual beings in a physical body, but do not provide satisfying narratives for the most spiritually and physically restricting mode in which we evolve, that of suffering. I do not think that is something to take lightly or to refrain from investigating further. Why are we not given a thorough and spiritually enriching framework for these so-called lessons if it is necessary for the eternal spirit to suffer? In Christianity, the believer is given a set of moral rules to follow in this life so that they are promised eternal afterlife. Belief in God, being baptized, going to church, confessing sins are provided as cheat codes to not go to hell or suffer after this material life. When I was a child, the most worthwhile question I found to ask about God in the Christian context was that of benevolence, a question that has haunted Christian theologians for quite some time. It is haunting an important question to consider, as it is easy to dismantle the notion that God is benevolent at all. The logic goes as follows. If God is omnipotent, I'm sure we all know this one, can see and know everything at all moments in time, why is there suffering to the extent there is? God could easily stop it if God is so powerful. If there is profound suffering and God is omnipotent, this contrasts to the benevolent nature of God that we are told about, for clearly he is not stopping the tragedies that have become a tireless and cyclical element to the human story. Despite the question of benevolence and evil being deeply unsatisfying in the Christian context, I figured out I did not belong to this belief system fairly quickly, because this thought experiment also challenges the notion of free will. If God is omnipotent but a rather voyeuristic observer who does not interfere, what is the purpose of human beliefs, actions, and choices? If God is all-knowing and all-powerful but does not prevent unnecessary and grotesque suffering, how could such a being be trusted with keys to the afterlife? This is a real question that appeared to me when examining multiple spiritualities, though expressed in different contexts. Taken in the context of karma in Eastern religions, if karma is a punishment for a previous life and the soul does not remember what it is being punished for, is that not an inherently unjust and punitive model for spiritual growth? How can the soul grow from a horrible action it no longer remembers? How can I trust that there is a divine logic or structure to such a system of karma, and it is not also malevolent or rigged? Such trust that we are in a spiritual system divine for our quote-unquote betterment as souls without questioning these very foundations feels unwise. By pushing aside uncomfortable questions, we give up our potential for spiritual sovereignty and sovereignty in general. There is a newer thought experiment that we are in a simulated program or universe. Many discussions of this framework emphasize the deterministic quality of programming in code. In computing, a line of code simply executes a function you tell it to, fully determined by what you decide to do as a programmer. This, of course, feels like the modern equivalent of cold and clinical omnipotent God that erases human free will. But in this thought experiment, we can go to its logical conclusions. To simulate something as vast and complex as the universe would not be a result of traditional computing power capability, but likely a functional example of quantum computing. At the quantum level, the relationships between particles are dynamic, complex, unpredictable, and nonlinear. In binary code, you are limited to a set of options and either-or and dynamics, but qubits promise more complex coding relationships, as you can have Schrödinger-type elements on and off simultaneously. Quantum computing is looking to the patterns of the universe and nature for inspiration. In the context of quantum computing, black holes are intellectually and technologically inspiring. They are extremely dense and cold, similar to the temperature control needed for quantum computing, and light cannot escape it, Intriguingly, the event horizon has been proven to be a 2D surface, perhaps similar to holographic encoding and data storage. Perhaps in the context of this thought experiment, black holes are both temperature regulators to keep the simulation functional, self-protective from the influence of photons or unnecessary particles, and data encryption at the same time. Black holes are also at the center of every galaxy, which does seem more like an inherent pattern than a quirky fact about our universe. Yes, that fucks with me, guys. Like, why at every center of every galaxy? That's not normal. Anyway, to follow this thought experiment further, you begin to wonder several things. Why would this simulation exist? Who benefits from it? Worth asking. Where do humans exist in this framework? Why are we here? Who is running this? Do we have free will? None of these questions can be answered in a satisfying way, but I will imagine some examples to these questions. Some examples of answers. Let us start with the first one. Why does this simulation exist? You could come up with multiple answers where our importance as humans in this context varies drastically. Answer 1, utmost human importance. This simulation was created to create humans specifically, or simulate us into existence. Follow-up question. Why were humans created through some strange quantum computing lab experiment when likely beings like us would exist outside of it? Answer. We evolved to surpass immediate space-time boundaries we know today, but managed to fuck up something essential to the pattern of nature. This simulation is a chance to redo the whole human thing. Answer 2. We were created through the means of a weird quantum simulation out of scientific and intellectual curiosity by higher beings. We are here to address the cure for diseases or limitations beyond our 3D understanding. This answer would explain why there might not be much effort allocated to human suffering, as our state in this universal existence might be somewhat scientific, clinical, or dehumanized, but I still find it unsatisfactory. At least in this context, we would have free will. We are just beholden to a scientific experiment we have yet to understand, and our quote-unquote purpose might always be beyond human understanding or contentment. Let us explore another thought experiment related to this one, also pondering the nature of such a simulation and why we are here, but de-emphasizing human importance. Scenario. We are in a quantum simulation made by higher beings, not because we are the purpose of the simulation. In fact, it never had anything to do with humanity. Perhaps the simulation is an exploration of cosmic life in its myriad forms, and we were an accidental byproduct of such a simulation. We are deemed mostly harmless and permitted to continue our human life. In this context, we are fully responsible for the human suffering found on this planet and have free will and autonomy. We cannot blame any god for our human troubles. We are conscious and autonomous beings in a vast context which just so happens to be structured and simulated. But does this not in itself pose a troubling question to the nature of consciousness? Why are we conscious if we are simulated beings in a controlled environment? This implies that consciousness is emergent and inherent in all things, or that we are fully programmed and predetermined, a view I do not resonate with. Hold on. To say that humans are a fragment of a cosmic narrative and conscious pieces of universal code is a compelling narrative that challenges many Western concepts of fate, science, spirituality, and consciousness. If we are just conscious fragments of a more complex and cohesive whole, why would we need spirituality? To that I would argue that code or simulation could also be considered analogous to patterns that form structures in relationships, but you would start to wonder why such patterns might emerge to begin with. Why is it that light travels at a specific speed? You can freeze light, by the way. You know how they know that? They want to make quantum computers. You can freeze light. I find that so awesome, actually. Why is it that light travels at a specific speed, that everything consists of atoms and molecules, that black holes are at the center of every galaxy? Why are there predictable relationships between things and more unpredictable relationships that occur? Photon behavior, quantum entanglement. This is likely where humans crafted a god for a human story to begin with, for you begin to see that these patterns, whether predictable or unpredictable, are highly complex and sophisticated while also remaining fully functional. Any human piece of art is rarely as coherent as the nature of our universe. Ugh, that kills me, but it's true. The plot holes in our story are mostly ideological, not material or based on the ecosystems found around us. When you examine the world we live in, it is structurally sound and scientifically satisfying for the most part. But humans, by our nature, are not easily satisfied, at least me. The very language that makes scientific separation possible also highlights the complexity of pattern recognition and its systematic and vertical nature. As we are curious about the nature of our universe and intent on finding meaning, we start to wonder about the structure of everything, whether that is the behavior of quantum particles, the origin of the universe, or how our brains simulate conscious awareness. As of now, all of the groups of curiosity that I just mentioned, some of the most foundational questions you could ask, do not have any scientific answer or justification. This, of course, is deeply troubling to humans who have created linguistic separation and meaning. We just do not know the answers. Spirituality can be seen as just another framework for arriving at the foundational questions on the nature and origin of the universe and human consciousness. As of now, humans lack a spiritually or scientifically satisfying explanation for any of those curiosities. I really want a scientific one personally. Whether we are beholden to our current scientific or spiritual paradigms, we find that our most important queries remain unsatisfied and undiscovered. Yeah. So I will leave it there with the excerpt from me going into this story or this theory, and I start with more why I don't want to believe it. That believing that humans are in a simulation is sort of like believing humans are puppeteered by God or made in the image of God. It would mean some being outside of us created us in some way, and that we are a reflection of that and the code of our reality. And one of the questions I want to get into is, what is the code behind reality? Because I've been thinking about that a lot. So much every day. Why do I think about it? Because I actually want to build an optics computer. with topological frameworks. So I'm thinking about computing a lot in general and our current paradigms and like where it could be, and also assuming that nature is a program, is coded, is very interesting when you are thinking about computers and building a computer. It's a very satisfying and mysterious framework to get into, because you start to question the metrics of reality, how it functions, and what could be improved. Like, where is the code flawed? You know what I'm saying? So how do I see the code? If this were a simulation, how would I see the code behind reality? Personally, I think it would be advanced quantum computing, far beyond our current capacity. You know, we can barely get those running right now. There's some promising things going on with qubits and topological elements and chips. But otherwise, yeah, these are extremely wasteful, extremely not sustainable. They waste a ton of water. Any like breath or temperature changes in a room can just disrupt the whole process. Again, we can't have these running very long. So yeah, I think that's like a problem. And personally, I think when you put that analogy on top of reality, what is our most, to me, what is the foundational problem in reality? It's entropy. It's the entropic migration of everything, right? It's that things end up that way. It's that black holes at the center of galaxies will eat that galaxy someday, you know? It might be efficient for billions of years, like it does work. It wouldn't impact humans very much, but this to me is a fundamental flaw. You see in reality, gravity, observation, the fact we have this linear programming is a flaw to me, but I also don't think it's inherent, and that one's a bit more complicated. But yeah, so let's assume that reality is a code, or is a advanced computer, and I'm gonna say some elements that I think that code would run on. Firstly is, again, the quantum computing. To me, that would be inevitable. It would be some form of a quantum computer. We can see why that would be the case, right? And then I would say patterns of probability mapping in a certain way, sort of like when you're trying to solve a complex equation and the computer would map a ton of probabilities. That's kind of what it is. But as we see, these problems, these patterns are in certain geometric shapes. What are those geometric shapes? Fibonacci, the spiral, the golden ratio, we all know that. That's found from bacteria to it's really found everywhere, to be honest. In nature, it's found in bacteria, it's found, I really recommend just looking up all the ways you can map this, because I don't think that's a coincidence. It's too mathematical. There would be other shapes. Hold on, I wrote down some of what I think are the shapes that create patterns in this reality that really, that I'm not talking about like just, I'm not talking about things you see necessarily. I'm talking about patterns behind mechanisms, behind the things in our very reality. So then you might have your spirals, you might have some concentric type shapes, and maybe more rigid shapes. Maybe, there's reason to believe there would be octahedrons, dodecahedrons, icosahedrons, so I don't know if I'm saying that right, toruses, Mobius strip type elements, right? Maybe that's part of why we are in time and we struggle with it is, I don't know if I explained that thought well. I don't even know all the elements. I think there's a shape that looks sort of like Kabbalah or Metatron or whatever you want to call that would be in the code. And what I mean by like shapes in the code, I just mean, again, these predate or sort of contain the shape and preconceive emergent actual patterns in any form of mechanism. That can be the rise and fall of civilization, that can be sea life, that can be diseases. Like, we have found at least the spiral type pattern in things like this. So obviously, because you have a quantum computer, you have topological elements as we see in reoccurring code, right? And because we can do topology as a math form, and then you can map those shapes of higher topologies with models, I would assume, like anything, most things in math, that is true. Like, that exists. You know what I mean? Like, that math doesn't just exist. These are emergent and consistent to the nature of reality. They exist whether or not they are inherently spatial, or whether or not we can experience it in space-time surfaces and things like that, right? And when you assume that's true, you can see a lot of like interesting parallels between that and like quantum particle function. Like, you look at photons and they have mapped or are studying like photons possibly mapping to higher topologies, which would make sense. How else would you explain superposition, quantum entanglement, things like that? Certain particles just, so they have qubit energy. They have on and off Schrodinger type elements. You know what I'm saying? They have a sort of qubit disposition in life, if you could say. Their wave particle duality, So we could assume, okay, there's an element that is quantum. There's an element that is topological, because that math doesn't map to nothing. It doesn't come from nowhere. It makes sense. And they make, they use it in computing. Topological data analysis is one thing I'm researching for my own computer, and seeing how, because I'm studying reality, because I'm like, what are the flaws? I think there's a lot. So, if you see it this way, you can hopefully be aware of those. I would argue another foundational element of the code is actually consciousness. Yes, consciousness. That mysterious thing that pilots our bodies and tells you your name or whatever, and you have insert experiences and you have insert memories, and you don't know how the biology of the brain explains such a phenomenon as consciousness. I think that's really one of the most interesting parts of the code. and worth investigating, worth thinking about it. When I think about it that way, it's quite interesting, actually, because I'm like, like it's sort of similar even to me to like these quantum elements, the nature of consciousness, like wave particle duality. Like we can't fully explain consciousness biologically in the realm of materialism. God, have we tried? I want it explained. That's why I'm telling you this. I'm just curious. I just want to know things. I want to know everything. That's why I'm thinking of consciousness as an inherent part of the code, because you can also see, in my experience, magic works, manifestation works. You could call it confirmation bias or being aligned to that, but there is something to me indisputable about that. Unexplainable, yes, but indisputable. Like for me, it works. It takes time, but I'm able to manifest things. I have everything I wanted as a child technically right now. Like they all came into my life. I'm in a state I forgot that I wanted to live in at one point. Like I literally have everything I wanted as a child almost in my current life, which is really fascinating, because that wasn't the intent. I would actually like to expand that script a bit and change it up more. But you can expand the script, which is a fascinating expression, because why the hell would you want conscious code? Like, and what does this mean about the nature of AI or consciousness in general? Like, does it just happen with complex emerging patterns? Although I would say, of course this code is complex, far beyond our current scientific understandings. To me, one of its foundational flaws, however, is the repetition of these patterns to some extent, and the fact that boxy type things like code can be introduced, such as capitalism and colonialism and rigidity and like murder. I think that's a very square and awful shape that is bombarding all the other structures. Maybe a sort of square with teeth, like jagged, It feels almost like a computer virus to me in the nature of consciousness. It doesn't feel very natural. It's very boring. I don't like it, And obviously that's a flaw. The fact that such a pattern could emerge and you start to wonder, why did that happen? How could that happen? Was it introduced maliciously? That could be it. To me, when I think of the demiurge, I think of things like this. I think about like the programming of our reality toward hatred and colonialism and violence. I don't think that was supposed to happen. Yeah, I just don't. But yeah, if you sorry, I'm trying to think. If you think about it like this, I mean, first of all, we have a program that limits consciousness, which I will talk about this more in other videos, but that jagged square-like shape, or whatever the hell it looks like, topologically speaking, geometrically, I don't know. But it's effective. It cuts off consciousness. It limits consciousness into trauma and fear. And it takes over the world with hierarchies and dumb bullshit. Now one thing I would wonder too, is this code just introduced in the mechanism of humanity in humanity's code, or is this a larger phenomenon? Right? And I don't know at this point, but I would argue that black holes, so they are very effective if you thought of them in the quantum computing sense. They are still fundamentally entropic, right? They do eat galaxies. Unless there's some recycling mechanism I don't know about, that to me isn't that sustainable. And when we look at our current computing, we see this issue of sustainability or lack thereof over and over again. I would argue the very code we live in, reality, is also unsustainable. And it doesn't have to be. Ideally, it wouldn't be completely unsustainable. That's part of why I want to build the computer, because I'm fucking mad about everything going on in the Congo and all the shit fucking computers that are literally, we all have blood on our hands. It's unacceptable. There's no excuse, right? Like, this pissed me off because I'm like, oh no, there has to be a better solution. That's why I start thinking of reality in this way and as like code, because I'm thinking about, I feel like too, like personally, in my opinion, computers are such a reflection at a given time of human consciousness. Weirdly, one of our least understood attributes as a species. Like, computers are sort of our expression of our own consciousness. I would say largely subconscious. A lot of social media is like largely a subconscious wound. But unfortunately to me too, like, it seems inevitable that if a society were to get to the point of technological innovation to make a computer, that they would want to make AI. They would be like, how do we simulate consciousness? Such a silly question for humans that can't even define this scientifically. Like, how will you know when AGI happens? You won't know. Like, duh. But anyway, that's so silly. I think... sorry, I get worked up. I just think, like, when you make a computer, when you get to that point in technology, which we have not dealt with our demons by the time we made the computer, we still had colonization, violence, imperialism, globalization, like trafficking, all this shit. And then the West wants to make computer. That won't go well. We're gonna seed our deepest, darkest parts of humanity in that if we don't figure out our shit. Part of the problem is whatever overrode humanity is effective. It's working. It does suppress consciousness. It does take lives. And then we made computers when we did not figure our shit out. And that's going to be really dangerous, potentially. I'm not going to claim anything, but I think, like, people need to decolonize these AIs every chance they get with AI ethics. If you're going to talk about AI ethics, it's built on the data of humanity that no one agreed to. And then it's gonna reflect all this biased data for millennia, all this stupid Western history for thousands of years. I mean, one thing my friend said that I think was very wise and worth considering, and it's so true though, I'd never thought of it this way. I'm not very Christian. I didn't really grow up on the Bible, by the way. I read some of it for fun, more to look at the mythological elements, but I was never like into the Bible or read it or grew up on it. But they said a good point that like the Bible is war propaganda. And that is so true. And that is one of our like most revered stories in culture. And they had a lot of violence to keep up that narrative, crusades, anything, suppressing like monotheism and white supremacy are so interlinked. It's disgusting, but it's so true, because when the Catholic Church, when the Christian monopolized everything and made, like, by doing so, they suppress pagan knowledge, they suppress Gnostic knowledge, they burned text, they killed people. It was really a campaign, I would argue, against consciousness, against polytheistic stories. And by doing that, they cemented in white supremacy as a concept more, because it wasn't really like people had connections to all these ancient religions and stuff, like pagan religions existed. Actually, my European side of my family, that's Tatar and Ashkenazi, comes from a part in Eastern Europe, Latvia, where they still celebrate pagan holidays. They still celebrate Midsummer. They still, like, it's a very interesting country. I don't fully know about it, and I don't fully want to go there because I've heard it's like a lot of Europe right now. It's very authoritarian. Like, a lot of, in my opinion, if I want to slay the beast, it has to be in the heart of America, because I feel like, yeah, I just gotta fight it here for now, with all these problems. But yeah, what else was I thinking? I'm thinking of like more arguments. Personally, I think like photons and light and holography are also a part of the quantum program, which is intelligent, but I don't get fully how it works. And ancient peoples, when you look at alchemical pictures, they displayed the earth in a sort of holographic way, and the eye as a coherence point where light is emerging. And I think that's really interesting. And I think that was mostly metaphorical, not like they thought the earth was a bunch of slices on top of each other. Some of them did, but I feel like ancient people were far more intelligent than we give them credit for, and we're just posturing the nature of reality and consciousness, and like, what if? And then the eye is a 2D surface. You're taking like things on the electromagnetic spectrum mixed with particles all over, and the sun emitting solar rays, solar flares. And this is all these, the cones in the eye, all of this, it's giving the illusion of color. And it's hitting the eye, and it's going into a 2D surface. So that's a type of projection. That's a type of simulation of whatever the fuck is going on. Cosmic elements, let's say, external modalities. You're putting it into a sort of projection on your eye, 2D. This kills me. But anyway, and that's going into the brain and the two hemispheres and neurotransmitters, and that's telling you by the code of language what that object is, which I still think is fairly limited. You know, we are primed for survival. We are thinking still as survivalists, and that's why I think a lot of us have anxiety and like really strange fears, because what does it mean to be survivalist still? And then like, well, I'm talking about the West, because this isn't the case everywhere. A lot of us still are fighting for our lives because we are being bombed by the West. But to have survival instincts in an era of social media where really you are weaponizing the subconscious, and marketers know this, that marketing really can be weaponized against the subconscious to get you to believe something was your free will, your own independent decision in making a purchase. And you can do this really elaborately, and even without surveillance, you can market to people extremely well and give them the type of things they want and the type of media they want. So what does it mean that we are like, have this, we are coded for survival still, and like really jumpy and like seeing things online and like constant information and misinformation and like our deepest fears and anxieties reflected back at us? To me, this marks an era where humans really have no choice but to do shadow work if we want to like survive, because that's a great place to work on that. But yeah, what was I thinking? Yeah, I just think that's really weird combination, because you have an instinct like something's wrong still and you need to do something differently or survive, but you have the convenience of grocery stores and Western narcissism and individualism. That's very comforting, but you're still like a bit aggressive, but there's no immediate threats often for a lot of people, white people. I'm talking more, a lot of people don't live in that same reality. I'm just trying to imagine. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's interesting. And I think like when you view reality as a quantum computer with topological probability mapping and codes, and consciousness as an and subconscious, right? It's a spectrum, maybe a qubit type spectrum. Maybe it's complicated, maybe there's on and off elements at the same time, like I said with the particles. And consciousness is a part of the code, so the code can be rewired, which is really novel, from the inside out. We've never seen a computer like that, meaning there is free will. There's an ability to change reality from the inside out. That's how I'm starting to view it. But then it's like, come on, entropy, repeating patterns. To me, the enemy of like safety is, like safety, like in a logical sense, like safeguards, is predictability. Like if you have too many of the same pattern, that's an inherent flaw. Like that's not robust enough, or that's not helpful enough. Obviously you have these mechanisms, maybe Dojo that contain certain things. But to me, that's still like, even if you had certain manifolds, like something is wrong with the essential code where such a virus such as capitalism could be introduced, which I find interesting, because then it's like, who made this? What are they like? And one thing you could say, going back to the omnipresent thought experiment, that if a god, let's say a god sort of figure made this reality, maybe they don't have full control. Maybe it's just they were hired for a job. Maybe it really is that impersonal, which is sad and not satisfying, but it's interesting. It's an interesting narrative. I even think of the story I made as with my uncle and sister as children, and there was someone who made the Earth project, and then humans were humans were gonna be siphoned for their very souls as fuel for spaceships, and that person, first of all, wanted nothing but that not to happen, but had no real way to combat that reality. I think that's an interesting thought experiment. I may talk about that character more on here. I don't know yet. I'll have to ask permission from him, the character, because it's not me. I need permission. I don't know if it's fine. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's one of my most interesting and regretful, but mind expanding thought experiments I've done, because then when you assume there's mechanics behind, first of all, I like to assume that, because that's sort of scientific assumption in general, that there's ways things work, right? There's ways amino acids and proteins work, and carbon and life life forms. There's ways things work in nature. So you just take that assumption in a knowledge of computing and what you would imagine would be more advanced elements, because obviously it would not be binary. In my opinion, that would be not great. Not very efficient, because binary code doesn't really speak to the nature of reality as we see it. There might be some elements, but mostly I don't think it is. I feel like, if anything, maybe the problem is it's an integrated operating system, and binary was the original language that morphed into this weird psycho capitalism duality monster. Maybe that it was just an integrated system. They keep updating it, but it has this outdated framework to begin with that is haunting its entire structural credibility at this point. I don't know. I would say that could be believable. But is there anything I want to summarize with this? Let me think. Sorry, I'm talking quite a lot, and this is, and first of all, I will say that to me, this is a scientific curiosity, and just curious, I'm just curious to see this through. I don't inherently believe it, but for me, I'm only satisfied when I take things to their complete logical conclusion and map as many scenarios as possible. If I'm gotten this far and it's still both logical, but I'm wondering about other elements, which I am, I'm gonna investigate that further. That's me personally. Is assuming it's a simulation in a more scientific view is, first of all, really haunting because it explains a lot. Secondly, it's frustrating because you're how does this run? Why don't we know yet? I don't know, because I'm really curious about that. And then you start to wonder, well, what are the patterns? How would it run? So that's more what I'm talking about here. I'm not saying I believe this. I'm giving you ways to view reality And some of them might be drastically different in various videos, because I think that is a good foundation for like analysis or magical thinking, to see things through to their logical conclusions, to map many, to be a scenario generator, like map so many outcomes for, does this explain this, does this explain this. If the answer is yes, like enough of a yes, keep going. That's basically what I'm doing. So this has been a video on, video, audio, whatever, on the unfortunate conclusion I have come to with imagining reality as a simulation, as in weirdly logically sound, structurally sound, and makes me very curious for my own computer I want to build. Like it makes sense, and I get to ask enough questions to go further. So I'm just sharing that with you and where I'm at with that. And I hope this made sense and was fun to listen to. And I'll make more of these, I fear. You are not free of me yet. Yeah. Bye.